Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second installment of the Urban Planning Design presented by Department of City Planning. With us is Jonah Rogoff. Just waiting for him to arrive. Hi, Mr. Rogoff.
Hi, Ms. Weatherspoon. Hi, everyone.
Good evening. Before we begin, I just want to be really clear about, first of all, thank you so much for your, this is your second meeting with us on October. So thank you for providing these design meetings so we have a better understanding of how the city's thoughts go behind what it is that they're doing for the various communities. I just want to be clear about communication. I understand that members of the Prospect Heights, North Prospect Heights Association reached out to you, and that's fine. But I just want to say that when you are doing presentations or scheduling appointments with them, they absolutely, and they know that, can reach out on the behalf of their organization. But as it relates to CB8, the communication and lines of communication sit with the district office. So I really want to be clear about that. So whenever you're ready, Mr. Rogoff, please begin. I just also want to say that this presentation should be about 15 to 20 minutes. And we also will have a 30-minute question and discussion period. Sharon Wedderburn will be moderating that portion. Thank you very much. Please begin, Mr. Rogoff.
Thanks, Ms. Weatherspoon. I just want to say, we take your lead. So we want to be a partner in this process. So I think going forward, we can, make sure that we are kind of on the same page with respect to all communication. So I'll just start by introducing myself. I believe I know most of the folks on the call. I'm Jonah. I'm a planner in the Brooklyn office of the Department of City Planning. I'm also joined by a few colleagues, including Jesse Hirakawa, who I'll be handing off to in a moment for the presentation. He's an urban designer in our office who's been working closely on M-Crown and a number of the projects in the area. We also have Amrita Mahesh, who's another urban designer in our office, who's here for support and backup. And then Winston will be joining in he's running a little late, but he'll be joining in about 15 to 20 minutes. So I'll just start off again by just reiterating what you were saying, Ms. Weatherspoon. We're happy to be here. This is intended to be the second part of an urban design presentation. If you recall, the first part was focused on general principles of urban design to kind of give you a taste of how we approach that within the department, talking about the role that urban designers play in the department in relation to neighborhood planning. For today, we wanted to really dive into M-Crown and give more context to how urban design kind of informed thinking around the framework, and specifically different approaches to mid-blocks versus corridors, and especially Atlantic Avenue. So we really intended this not as a full zoning proposal. We're not here to, say this is a zoning or not, this isn't the zoning. But that being said, we want to show how the private applications are consistent with some of our thinking. And in turn, we also want to hear from members of the board to see how urban design can better inform the private applications. I also just want to say that before I turn it over, we're here to really be a partner. This is part of an ongoing engagement conversation. We know that there's a lot of engagement around M-Crown, and we're still interested in kind of moving forward and seeing how we can do that in the next administration. We're also, it's not just us, but it's part of a larger team as well. So for many issues, we work closely with HPD or DOT, but we're really here on behalf of the department to focus on urban design today. And with that being said, I will now turn it over to Jesse to start the presentation.
Awesome. Thank you, Jonah. I'm Jesse Hirakawa. I really wish I could turn my camera on today, but my computer's camera is not working. But I was last meeting. I hope some of you did see who I was last month, or 2 months ago when last time we were here. But yeah, as just echoing Jonah and Mrs. Weatherspoon, thank you so much for inviting us to continue this conversation along the urban design practice at city planning. And so,
Thank you.
good evening. Oh yeah, thank you. So good evening. Thank you all. I know it's happy holiday time, but I'll try to keep this quick, but also informative for everyone, at least on the practice of urban design. Oh, next. And so last time in October, I briefly wanted to just reiterate some of the things that we had gone over last 2 months ago, right? We kind of familiarized ourselves with the practice, like what is urban design, what is important. We looked at understanding the role of the urban designers within city planning, because there are a lot of city planners and that have different specialties, but then there's a few of us that specialize in urban design at city planning. And then we also quickly went over some of the principles that, what are some of the guiding principles that guide urban design. And so for today, kind of moving on for part 2, we wanted to get a little bit more in depth in terms of, as Jonah was saying, right, how does urban design inform a neighborhood's future, right? Like looking through observation and data and analysis, we can make some decisions with the community that really relate to different streets or different contexts, and how do we do that? Lastly, we're going to look a little bit more into the building form and how it can support local and citywide goals, right? Especially how buildings are perceived from experiences, or how does a different street width, or there are larger streets, there are smaller streets, right? And how can these all be different? And as a quick refresher, right? Urban design, what is urban design in a nutshell, right? Urban design, we focus on people and how they interact with the public realm, which is made up of streets, buildings, parks, plazas, and kind of all the spaces in between, right? Whether it's kind of like a infrastructure of a rail, or like under the elevated structures, or is it next to a waterfront, right? Is it a sidewalk? It's really a focus on what urban design is. And last time we were here, there was kind of a discussion about the different areas within the city and how different city agencies have different purviews kind of within the city. Some have a greater impact in the public realm than others. So when looking, I just grabbed kind of a familiar corner. I believe it's Vanderbilt and Pacific that a lot of you are familiar with. I grabbed a quick one just to kind of go through this general exercise to understand the different jurisdictions. And so Department of City Planning, known as DCP, our jurisdiction really lies within kind of zoning on properties, right? On prime properties, right? We look at the use, right? Whether it's going to be a residential use, is it going to be a commercial use, or is it a community facility use, right? Are we looking at the height of the building, or is the zoning looking at like how does the building meet the street? Where does it set back, right? What is the height, the maximum height of a building? That's kind of pretty much where the DCP kind of purview under zoning. Where our purview is not is kind of the actual design of the building. Like we are not actually designing a building, right? That's where the architects come in. We don't get to, our purview is not who lives there, right? Or who works there, or what business goes inside. That's kind of beyond our purview. Also what happens between the buildings. Yeah, as you said, on Vanderbilt, we're doing like, if it's a tree, right, that's more or less kind of the Parks Department looks at those where the trees are. Looking at the sidewalk or the crosswalks, that's definitely Department of Transportation, DOT. You can also see kind of an outdoor restaurant kind of place popping up here that is also under the Department of Transportation, right? The Open Restaurants Program with the DOT program. That's under their jurisdiction. Moving on. And so kind of continuing this observation of attributes in a neighborhood, you know, when looking at urban design for a study, we really want to start by zooming out, right, and identifying where the hubs are, transit corridors, job centers, connections, at least within the borough. And so for this example, you know, we're kind of zooming out from Atlantic Avenue in the Brooklyn area and understanding that at least in this area, there are kind of two main corridors, right, whether it's 4th Avenue and Atlantic Avenue, at least with this proximity to downtown Brooklyn. And so, you know, kind of using our neighborhood, this neighborhood as an example, right? With 120-foot wide street, in some areas, Atlantic Avenue is one of those main infrastructure attributes within the neighborhood, right? It's a main corridor for us. And, you know, really taking the time to understand where local connectors are, where the corridors are, what are these assets that sit along a main transit area really helps us get an idea where the best places are for growth or preservation could be. And on top of that, not just that, we also make sure we do that by observing, you know, we also make site visits. We actually, you know, want to make sure we're there, really understanding the neighborhood. And as an addition to observing the attributes of the neighborhood, right? For example, Atlantic Avenue, it's a major west and east thoroughfare. It's a truck route. It has multiple north and south neighborhood connectors, right? 6 to 7 lanes with parking, medians with various widths, also very rich in transit. And on another side, on the bottom, like Pacific Avenue, right? It's more of a local road. It's at 70 feet in width. Usually 1 to 2 lanes with some street parking. And the uses kind of shift, right? There's, and at least in this one, there's more residential and manufacturing in this area. Continuing the observations, right? Other aspects of this neighborhood, right? At least the existing building typology. There are larger manufacturing warehouses. And, you know, these can be opportunities for preservation and adaptive reuses, right, of existing buildings and lofts. Continuing the observations of the neighborhood, right, additionally to the public realm, right, I think we mentioned this last time, right, we went out and measured all the sidewalks. And this may be repetitive for some of you, but right, if there are any type of increased development, we see an opportunity to increase sidewalk widths, at least to accommodate people. And currently a majority of the sidewalk widths along this area of Atlantic are less than 13 feet wide. And so we see this as opportunities, you know, to propose sidewalk widths, right? Or widenings, sorry. Kind of moving quickly, and this is a diagram that some of you may be familiar with, but really, you know, shaped by urban design thinking, there are multiple opportunities to consider, right? Some are competing, while some are complementing each other when identifying opportunities for growth, right? And really being met through this geography through looking at each corridor differently, balancing them together, where certain things are appropriate depending on the existing conditions. And if this is confusing, we're going to break it down a little bit more as we move on. But I just wanted to quickly say that there are, you know, multiple opportunities to consider. And kind of breaking it down a little bit even more, right, on how we look at urban design, really understanding the potential of a lot, right? What is an existing lot on a corner, or whether it's an interior lot, right, in the middle of the block. And these opportunities happen at different scales, right? What can be accommodated at a corner is very different than what can be accommodated in the middle of a block, right? And sometimes what's typical, at least in in this neighborhood, right, there's corner lots are typically 100 by 100 feet, right, are kind of standard in some areas where the lots in the interior vary actually. Like there's a lot that are in the 25 feet width, right, these smaller lots, and some of them are actually a lot larger in width. But really understanding these potentials and understanding these different typologies and configurations and how they can achieve the goals, right? And so understanding these potentials, right, there's a lot to understand, whether it's the size of the lot, the size of the block, right? Streets like Atlantic Avenue with a larger width, you can do a lot larger base heights, right? Sometimes when we're looking, and we said this last time, but sometimes some of the general rules of urban design principles that we like to support is having a 1-to-1 ratio of kind of a street width and base height of a building. That's typically, that's not always the case, but it's typically a general rule of thumb that we like to think of. And kind of in this aerial, I did a shot of this because there's multiple different corridors here. We can see like a main corridor like Atlantic Avenue on the northern side, also smaller connector streets like Grand and Classen that kind of cut through. There's also areas of the interior blocks that we were looking at, and also opportunities for corner lots that we were looking at. And so zoning districts, right? There's several off-the-shelf zoning districts that are currently existing. And these are usually a starting point when we start to think about what kind of zoning districts, to place in different areas. And these are really just a tool. Zoning is really just a tool that we can model based off of different locations, and these districts have different relationships in terms of the base and how tall these buildings can be, right? So some questions that we usually ask ourselves is, well, what is appropriate, right? What is an appropriate zoning district in different areas, right? What produces a building form that is being proposed, right? At what scale is desirable? What is desirable for the block, for the corridor, for its adjacencies, right? Not just in that one location, but how it fits in the larger context, right? So starting from R1 on the left is a very kind of lower, smaller density. We're going all the way to like R10 is kind of this tower density that we look at. And everything in between, right? Right, and each zoning district has a different envelope, and an envelope is this kind of blue dash white line that we have drawn out here. And we like to think of envelopes that are kind of like sweaters where architects kind of design within, right? So if zoning DCP, we have the envelope, then architects are allowed to design within the envelope, right? Sometimes larger envelopes can allow architects to have more creative liberties to create more distinct buildings, whereas kind of sometimes smaller envelopes can be a little bit more compressed, or sometimes buildings a little bit more compact, right? And so in tandem with looking at appropriate envelopes, right, or sweaters or envelopes, right, for where they could be placed, it also conveys that there are trade-offs that kind of go hand in hand with selecting different districts, right? Some districts that can allow for more floor area and heights, kind of company will eventually provide more housing and support more uses, right? And sometimes less parking, and can accommodate for higher quality of design. Whereas kind of the lower districts, as I was kind of saying earlier, we'll get something that, we'll get a building that looks like its surrounding context, but sometimes has less mix of uses and can cause density that does not support, or will not, maybe not get a superior design because there's less opportunity within that envelope, right? And so the advantage of a neighborhood rezoning, as we're all kind of, a lot of us are discussing about, is we are able to balance all of these together, right? Versus the private applications offsets. And really finding these opportunities and looking at really looking at some areas that can go higher, some areas that can go lower, right? For an example, like Atlantic Avenue, you can kind of push a little higher, whereas kind of the smaller streets, you want to maintain it a little bit lower, right? And so kind of, looking at these sub areas now, I'm gonna try to break down some of kind of the discussions that when I talked about envelopes and blocks and existing conditions, I'm kind of going to break down a little bit more about some of our initial observations of each of these sub areas. So the first one, right, looking at the first sub area that I kind of highlighted or put a dash line around, and this is how I'm going to indicate which area we're talking about. Really, we want to walk through each sub area and how urban design has informed this approach. So the first one, which is the light yellow, really when looking at this area, there's a lot of underdeveloped lots, right? There's opportunity, and that provides a lot of opportunity. There's wide sidewalks, it's a 70-foot wide street. Really opportunities for active ground floor uses. Yeah, and so I'm going to move on because this is more visible, right? For example, some people may remember that 1010 Pacific, which is not done yet, even though it wasn't the promised design, but it did create a building form that is appropriate for the block. And, we can argue with the design, whether it's good or bad, but typically the envelopes are the ones that are going to stay, right? And so side streets like this, Pacific Street, is a great example when looking at a relationship between the street width and the building heights, right? And so, really on the right is the existing conditions of what Pacific Street currently looks like, whereas on the left is kind of a mock-up of a diagram, whereas if it's a 70-foot wide street, what kind of bases could be acceptable on a 70-foot wide street, right? And typically it's 75 feet bases maybe, right? And sometimes there's always a good setback where anything beyond that is not really perceived from the pedestrian aspect, right? And street trees always come in because that's part of the zoning resolution to have a development. Moving on to kind of the dark yellow areas, right? These are kind of areas on the corner lots, right? Kind of along, what's this, Grand and Classen, right? Really to help serve the north and south connectors, right? Where we can envision active ground floor uses, at least similar to the nearby north and south corridors, right? In this area, we can kind of encourage a little bit more moderate density, right? At least with mixed use developments at the corners, for prominent corners and corridors. And these corners can handle a little bit more taller density, kind of like at Franklin and Dean. Really using these corners to support more moderate densities or repurposing of these larger warehouse typologies. Moving on to more of the non-residential uses, which are in the purple area. This is the area where the blocks for the SS shuttle kind of cuts through. It's also where so the GMDC building, there's like large MTA lots, there's some existing warehouses, right? We really saw this area as opportunities to maintain and support clusters of commercial and industrial uses. And really while looking at these existing conditions, how can the urban design stimulate growth of new spaces for the ranges of jobs, strengthening the existing job clusters, at an appropriate scale that allows for multi-story loft-style buildings. And lastly, Atlantic Avenue, which I know is going to be a great discussion of Atlantic Avenue, definitely one of the widest corridors in Brooklyn, right? It's a corridor definitely that has a lot of opportunity within the study area for higher density mixed-use development with affordable housing and active ground floor uses. Also seen as potential sidewalk windings, as we were mentioning earlier. And so really trying to wrap up Atlantic Avenue now, but we can't really talk about Atlantic Avenue without addressing its context within Brooklyn, and as we stated before, we see this as a corridor for opportunity within the borough and the study area, really to improve safety, strengthen streetscape experiences, and support neighborhood connections, right? And outside of downtown Brooklyn, major corridors such as Atlantic Avenue and 4th Avenue there are really limited opportunities that can really handle higher densities, right? Particularly as the borough, we're experiencing greater pressures to address the housing needs, right? And for a short reference, 4th Avenue here, right, which was recently approved along 4th Avenue for R9A, which is actually similar conditions, right, as 120 feet like Atlantic Avenue, its proximity to transit, and its main corridor for within the borough. Also, right, it's Atlantic Avenue we see it as serving as its larger role within the borough, especially with its regional transit access, its central access to central business hubs, its adjacency to local transit, LIRR, and other major corridors, right? And so I have my last 2 slides that I'll leave us with. But really, at Atlantic Avenue, we thought we would reference some of the more 2 recent approved projects that a lot of you are familiar with, right? 1045 Atlantic on the left, 845 Atlantic on the right. We do believe, just to be out there, we do believe that these projects were appropriate, the zoning districts were appropriate in these locations. At least along Atlantic Avenue, because of its proximity to transit, a wide avenue, it's one of the very few areas that can handle this type of density and opportunities for MIH, especially growth along Atlantic Avenue. The question is really how much growth is appropriate, right? I think that's the question that we're all asking. And so I think much further, for some context, much further to East New York, right? A lot further down Atlantic Avenue to the east, it is currently R8 density. And so the last slide that I'll leave us with, really looking at a section cut of Atlantic Avenue for some of the recent approved applications with R9A density along Atlantic Avenue, we see that base heights, as we were talking about, something that's comfortable with a wide street, that 1-to-1 ratio of 120, 125, typically that 1-to-1 ratio that we're comfortable with. And then, its adjacency to at least the in comparison to R6B, right? I think that was some of one of the questions that was brought up earlier. Further along at 1045 Atlantic, it is adjacent to R6B there. I would also say that, whenever a higher density like R9A is adjacent to R6B, there are existing rules in the zoning resolution that accommodates us, right? That makes sure that really addresses the difference, and to make sure that I believe it's within 25 feet of the lower district, we get capped at a height, right? We're not allowed to build that close to a zoning district, right? Even though the envelope's there, the actual building can't get that close. Right, and so that does kind of conclude the talk on the height of Atlantic Avenue. And I know there's a lot of other questions that were sent earlier, concerning to zoning, concerning to capital planning, environmental review, environmental analysis, right? There's so many other topics that we could talk about. And, we do welcome those questions, but, we want to make sure that we keep the discussion towards urban design, at least today. And, we do, as Jonah was saying, really look forward to continuing to work with you on other topics like, environmental review or capital planning, investments. But yeah, that does conclude the urban design last portion. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Jesse Hawakawa. And Jonah, did you have something that you wanted to add or say before we move on to questions? I do see that Winston Bonango has arrived. So if you have anything that you want to say to the audience, that would be great now before we get into questions or comments.
Thanks, Ms. Weatherspoon. I've nothing to add. I think Jesse covered everything. I would just echo the point about this is part of an ongoing dialogue with the board members, with the community. And so we just appreciate the chance to be here and discuss this. And we look forward to hearing questions and comments.
We appreciate your efforts and really arriving at solutions to benefit the whole community. So we thank you. Okay, do we have any questions or comments at this time? And if we do, if you could you raise your hand so Ms. Wedderburn can acknowledge you?
How do you raise your hand if you're calling on it from a phone?
Well, for those who are calling in, it's not gonna be that easy, so they can just speak and just acknowledge. We'll acknowledge them if they start speaking.
Okay, well.
And Rob, also, if you want to be able to do that, what you do is there are 3 dots at the bottom of the panel, right? That'll take you into a screen where you can change audio, turn off your speaker, chat with everyone. At the very top of that, there are a number of emojis. To the far left, you'll see a hand. So pressing that hand will raise your hand.
You got it. Here's his hand.
Okay, there we go. So Rob Puka, do you have a question, comment, statement?
Just question. For example, I think 1010 Pacific Street was mentioned, and I'm not sure. I think it's an appropriate question. How do we prevent, for example, that zoning was changed, and then after the zoning was changed, the person who owned it at the time came before the community board, came before city planning, and presented his vision, presented his diagrams. He got the zoning, and then immediately what the developer do? The developer flipped the property to someone else. So now the new owner, the new developer got the advantage of the zoning of the upzoning. I don't want to call it rezoning, of the upzoning, and he didn't come before the community board. He didn't come before city planning. So it just sort of like I almost felt it was like a bait and switch. So how does city planning or maybe the community board prevent these bait and switches, or prevent the developer who gets the benefit of the upzoning, makes his property worth more money, and now he flips it for a profit? So is there any mechanism in city planning, to think about this, or how to prevent something like this? Thank you. And by the way, happy holidays to everyone. Safe and healthy for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very same to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Puka. I'm going to start off, and I'm sure others from our team would like to jump in. I would just say that every zoning approval, regardless of the new owner, or if it's an existing owner or new developer, there are certain strict restrictions that are attached to that. So, for example, with 1010 Pacific, as Jesse noted in his presentation, the commission is approving the zoning change, which means the heights, the setback, the envelope. But also, in addition to that, another important piece was the requirements for mandatory inclusionary housing, or MIH. And so those carry certain restrictions as well. So if they build residential, then they're required to provide a certain percentage of affordable housing based on the options that are selected. I would also just add to that, this gets into the more nitty gritty of zoning actions, but often there are certain environmental restrictions as well. So in manufacturing areas, it's really common for sites that need to be remediated and cleaned up. And so in connection with the zoning change, there are certain requirements that live with the land as far as remediation. We call those E-designations. I'm happy to talk more about that. I would also say that, with respect to the, I know that the prior owner for 1010 Pacific committed to certain uses. It was kind of a soft commitment without, in comparison to the more recent applications, and that when we heard that there was a new owner, they actually reached out to us and we asked them to honor that commitment, even though they did not do that. But I just want to, we really do want to encourage them, to do that. But at the same time, zoning changes are not, that detailed to the point of the architectural design. And so, but that being said, we do encourage all applicants to maintain a relationship with the board. And I think, what we've seen in the most recent applications is, certain developers are doing that. They're honoring their commitments. But yeah, I think it's a good question. It's just, we have to abide by the purview that zoning changes have. And it's, I don't know if others want to jump in.
So I'll just jump in for a moment, Rob. What you're seeing is that going forward with what we've done is that we put restrictions upon the deeds, so that if it transfers from one owner to another owner, especially in regards to use, there's that stipulation. So the next person who has a raised hand is Kathy. Kathy, you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you, Ms. Wedderburn. And thank you to DCP for these conversations. They're very useful. And I find having the dialogue and getting to know the people involved in the process really makes it feel like we have a resource that's available to us. So thank you. And thank you also, Jonah, for answering NPHA's email when we were inquiring just about this meeting. We did at the same time, just for the record, CC the district office and Chair Weatherspoon at the same time. So thank you. My question has to do with something I think, Jonah, you said, which is, or Jesse, particularly about a slide that DCP is focused on what's appropriate for a building, for a street, for making the best use of what seems to be sites. And then Jesse said, and here's a tree, and that's the Department of Parks, and we need to call, Department of Sanitation takes care of this, and Department of Transportation takes care of this. At what point is the conversation that involves all of you in city planning so that the infrastructure and resources, even Department of Education, we're about to get a huge increase in units and families on Atlantic Avenue, and nobody has talked, as far as we have heard, we haven't heard about the conversation about seats for schools and all of these things. So I'm interested in the process, excuse me. And I know we want to keep the focus on planning tonight, but it seems to me that city planning includes all of those aspects of making a neighborhood improved and to serve its community. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. I appreciate that. I'll start off, but also let others jump in, our team. I would just say that the reference to the street trees, and even though it's under the Parks Department purview, that actually is a zoning requirement. So when you're building commercial or residential, you're required to have a street tree roughly for every 25 feet of frontage. So we just wanted to kind of put that in there. But broadly speaking, we have a good relationship with Parks Planning. They're kind of our sister agency. There's a lot of different opportunities for collaboration. We started speaking with them earlier in the pandemic, actually, when we were kind of, considering different elements of a neighborhood plan. But, we're happy to, figure out different opportunities to work with them. Certain things are under their purview, but we work together with them as far as new development for a neighborhood, and how parks can kind of complement that growth. I should also mention too that there's an environmental review aspect to this as well, in that for each project there's an environmental review component that is reviewed by Parks. So they play a role in that as well. But I would say, our door is open. We've been talking with the Parks Department. We want to continue doing that, depending on, the vision for M-Crown and opportunities that we have.
Jonah, this is Winston. If I could add to what Jonah just said, I want to let you all know that just because a project got rezoned and it's getting built, that city government does not stop working at that point, right? We work with our colleagues at the School Construction Authority and the Department of Education regarding schools. We continually work with the Parks Department, with the Department of Transportation, with DEP. These agencies continue to review all the projects that are going forward, that are going on in the city to deal with growth. Each and every time. That is their job. And you should know that just because an area got rezoned and there's an increase, that does not stop city government and the people in the 300,000 colleagues of ours from working to deal with that growth. That's their job. That's what they do every day.
So I'd also like to add to that question as someone who used to chair the Youth and Education Committee. And we cover districts 13, 16, and 17, Community Board 8 does. And what we do is we have a good relationship with the local CECs, the Community Education Councils, and derived from that relationship, we also have a good relationship with the superintendents. So there are two departments within the Department of Education that look at things such as enrollment and planning. For the purposes of planning, you know, it's sort of backward looking in that they have to look at census numbers and the American Consumer Survey, which comes out like every 2 years. So it sort of refreshes the data in regards to population. But because you have someone like me or someone like the community board sitting at the table when we're talking about things like enrollment, we have community information. For example, Newswalk 535 Dean Street had not made the Department of Education map, right? And, you know, there used to be an assumption that a child was guaranteed an elementary school seat within half a mile within the school. So what you had is when you had a co-location of a charter school with PS9, you had overcrowding. So what the Department of Education did within the same district, they zoned Newswalk for PS11, which you know is on the other side of Atlantic Avenue, and it's also a highly desirable, high-performing school. So within a particular district, they make allowances for that. And the planning district-wide. So they're actually looking at what schools have high occupancy rates and those that have less occupancy rates, and they're tailoring the programs to make sure that each child can have the opportunity to have the appropriate education within close proximity to their homes. So the trend that we had seen at one point with new development coming into the district of a new school being built in a particular area, I know that particular CECs have asked developers not to do that, but provide additional support to existing school programs. Also, with a new administration, one of the things that they're discussing, the community education councils have something called the Education Council Consortium. And one thing that hasn't been updated in a really long time are the community school district lines. And there's discussion about that in regards to population, in acknowledgement that you have high density or the potential of having a high density of students in areas that had not been considered. So look forward to that coming up, you know, pretty much a discussion that's happening along with the development of these properties along Atlantic Avenue. And it's something that's being carefully watched.
Next question, Ms. Wedderburn. We have a couple of hands up. You're muted. You're muted. Ms. Wedderburn, you're muted.
It is difficult working with a couple of devices, and I thought it would be a little bit more efficient. I see Ms. Gibbs.
Before Ms.
you have a
Gibbs,
question?
Yes.
I'm sorry. Before
There
Ms.
was somebody
Gibbs,
before me.
Mr. Crashes
Peter.
had his name.
I'm
Yes,
so sorry.
his hand.
Go ahead, Mr. Crashes.
Yes, happy holidays, everybody. And one of my questions is definitely going to be what Mr. Von Engel's cat's name is, because I see him having a big role in the meeting here. Actually, I'm just going to build on what Sharon just said a little bit, but also maybe connect it to some of the other things that were just said, because we were looking at the numbers of units for like Atlantic Avenue between Vanderbilt and I think Clausen that have been approved or on the pipeline roughly at this point. And we're in that vicinity, we see roughly about 1,200 units of new housing that's going to come about there. So I think one of the things that I'd like to ask about is maybe, and I can just, because I think this is part of what Kathy was talking about, but maybe going back exactly to what Sharon was saying about schools, let's maybe focus on schools in all those units, because, with Atlantic Yards, we have an expectation of about 1,877 demand for 1,877 school seats beyond what's being provided by the project. And that's still not accommodated for in the area. And I know that Sharon said Ms. Walk was shifted into PS11. I think actually it's always been PS11, at least as far as but we can talk about that. We continue that afterwards. But I think the question is, what is the plan? Because if you look at some of the other neighborhoods where these upzonings have taken place, and downtown Brooklyn's a really good one. It's been referred to in the presentation earlier. You see that the shortfalls are dealt with what's called 80 Flatbush, where the developer is given a really big bonus to the building in order to provide, renovate one school and build another. There was definitely a crisis. I can't remember what it was. We don't want to make up the name, but PS20 maybe in downtown Brooklyn and Dumbo downtown Brooklyn area, where there was major capacity issues that this DOE didn't anticipate. And so when you're adding these individual applications one after the other, you're not actually creating, the city doesn't have that doesn't have the push, the political push to set aside a method and a plan for creating that capacity. And so a very simple question to DCP that's been asked before, and it'd be really great for somebody in DOE or DCP to lay out, is what is the plan? Because there's definitely not enough space left in PS9 with the removal of the charter school. So how about just telling us what the plan is? Very simple. And I wanted to wait one other aside though. To Mr. Puka's question about how we can hold these developers accountable for commitments they make to the community board. The way that these these projects are moving forward, they include the project of the applicant, but they also include other extended districts where they're not going to be asked to make they can't be asked to make any commitment to the community board. So we're upzoning much larger areas than are being covered by the commitments that the community board gets attached to it. So I'd like that's a point, but the question is, can DCP and DOE please once and for all lay out the plan for let's just focus on elementary school seats for all of these new units being added in.
So if I could, your questions on schools and all the other concerns about parks are all valid questions. And I would like to suggest that these are valid questions for a separate meeting to discuss schools planning and parks planning and other planning issues. We wanted today to talk, or this evening, to talk about what makes a project size and density, how we look at projects using a lens of urban design, supposing that there are enough seats, supposing that there is enough sewer and water capacity, supposing that there are enough parks. It's if you will, a bit of a theoretical presentation in that sense, but we wanted to focus this evening on urban design. What makes a building appropriate to be at a certain height? to be a certain density? Like what goes into that thinking to give you an insight and to hear your questions and your comments about that. Your questions about the schools and about parks, all valid questions, and our suggestion would be to answer those questions in a separate meeting that we can hold just on those issues alone.
But Mr. Von Engel, I mean, we are right in the middle of a process of the community of two individual applications moving forward that are removing some of the leverage the community has to have a neighborhood-wide rezone, and where you would actually, as part of that process, have some kind of plan or answer. You would provide one, and so like asking to move an answer forward or have a meeting after these applications go forward just seems bad timing for us. And we've asked the question. DCP's heard the question before. DOE's heard the question before for years. So it's really simple question. You guys should be prepared to answer the question regardless of receiving it. You know this question is a key one. And so, you know, I instead of actually trying to kick the ball down the road, you have the opportunity here. And it does relate to the scale of the buildings that because if you don't have the capacity to accommodate the population in the neighborhood, then the scale of the building probably should be smaller, shouldn't it? So this is why, so let's talk about that. Please, you know, these are linked. This isn't a planning and design question. It's a central one.
Right. I mean, I would point out that each of the projects themselves, each of the rezonings have an environmental analysis attached to it that takes into account each of the projects, including the ones and especially the ones before it, right? So it does look at all of the issues that you're discussing here. You're asking a very valid question, Mr. Crash, is about an overall more comprehensive look, a coordinated look at the neighborhood. And that is, this meeting is part of that process of having an overall look. The individual rezonings, again, are getting reviewed on their own. You're also involved, the community board is involved in a process of identifying, just finished identifying community district needs, and has in fact flagged this area as in need of more coordinated planning, and we're going to respond to that. And in part, it'll be up to the next administration to decide whether or not to go forward with a study and a planning effort here, right? Again, we wanted to focus, that's why we have Jesse here this evening, on urban design. We're happy, literally happy, to come back to talk to you about capital planning and about how we plan for infrastructure.
And I just might add, I'm sure that the local CEC would be very happy. She's a very active person, a very active person, and to bring along the parties that would do that planning from DOE. And Peter, one more thing. Newswork was not always zoned for PS11.
I think what you had said, Sharon, was that it was in the context of the capacity questions around the middle school being approved on.
Nope, I wasn't referring to the middle school. I was specifically talking about PS11, the elementary schools.
It has been it was PS11 prior to that. Thank you.
Ms. Gibbs, you have a question?
Yes. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm glad these questions are being asked because I've heard them time and time again when all the new developments in this district have been going up. And again, it's not, I don't want DCP to feel like we're negating his planning meeting, but this is part of our planning because we live here. And if this is not part of the planning process, what is part of the planning process? Like someone like it's been said before me and everyone else, if both sides of Atlantic Avenue are already dense populations, or both the schools on both sides of Atlantic Avenue are over capacity or at capacity, if not over capacity, that's schools should be the baseline or the density on each side of that corridor you be taking into consideration. That's part of the planning. I mean, I really cannot wholeheartedly go ahead to, I feel like I'm entertaining this meeting by simply you're not bringing the part of the planning that the community is concerned about. Our resources here. They're putting you're approving the upzoning of Atlantic Avenue, but not putting the resources in place for the people who are possibly moving in, and even the ones who recently moved in from the other upzoning of the other properties in the district. So that's where, I mean, don't almost like we're beating a common drum or beating the same dead horse, but it's important to us because at the end of the day, we're all being punched in, smothered. That's it.
I just want to say I appreciate that comment, Tamika, and we definitely hear you. That's one of the reasons we actually included capital planning as kind of the immediate next step. And I understand that there's kind of like, how do you divorce kind of like the design and new building with the infrastructure and broader needs of the area. So I think we just, as you know, it's not just us, it's like a effort with other agencies. We have a capital planning division. So I'm going to work to see, when can we kind of come back, maybe later in January, or as early as we can, to kind of, and this is actually something that we've been planning for the past few months. So we're happy to have that.
And it probably be a little bit easier if DCP actually look at both sides of the land. I don't know how far in extent the planning, the research goes, but if you just look at not even, I wouldn't say the because, well, excuse me, my animals, the population around on both sides of Atlantic Avenue, but physically look at maybe it is a good idea to scale down some of the projects because we understand the upzoning, but at the same token, where are we putting the people that's already here, much less the 1,200 other families that are coming here? You're creating a muster of you're creating a problem that's already smoldering. That's all.
Thank you, Ms. Gibbs. Kaja Kuhl, Ms. Kuhl.
Hi, everyone. Here I am. Thank you for having this meeting. I actually have an urban design question to you, Jesse and Winston. Apologies that I don't know this, but Jesse referred to some kind of rule if the R9 abuts an R6B. Can you clarify that in light of 1045, where I think you're all aware that the residents of Lefferts Place are pretty upset about the fact that this was approved, and felt like they weren't heard enough. And so that's one situation where that occurs. I'm curious if this huge difference occurs anywhere else in the city. And then in addition to that question, also, you sort of showed 4th Avenue as an example that's very similar to Atlantic Avenue. And I wasn't aware that 4th Avenue is R9. Is that part of the recent Gowanus rezoning, that there's a small portion that's now R9? Because the majority of it really isn't, right? And it's so can you say a little bit more about why you think this enormous height, when it abuts a very small scale residential contextual district in the mid-block, seems appropriate? Because the width of Atlantic, we all get it, but in the back, in my backyard, I guess I don't have to be shy to say that, it's not that wide next to a 175 feet tall building.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Kaya. I think to your first question, we mentioned a transition rule, and I think that's the more common name we call it, but in the zoning resolution, and I can link you later, but they have a rule where adjacent to anything below R6B, if it's adjacent to whether it's R7 and above, when they have those adjacencies within 25 feet of that R6B district, they're capped at a certain height, right? And that actually does kind of go into effect with the 1045 Atlantic project that you're referencing, right? Within 25 feet, they're not allowed to build. I think it's capped at 55 feet. There's a certain cap where they're not allowed to build to a certain height that's stated out in the zoning resolution, so that they can avoid any of the shadow or light and air concerns. And I think to directly address, the Lefferts Place residents, I think, in the way the agency, we were able to support kind of the R9A at that area, or in the mid block there. I think, we had looked at, internally our analysis if they were going to go to a lower district, but with a larger envelope, the architect was actually able to really carve into the building a lot. Like, even though the R9A envelope is pretty tall at that area, given the flexibility with the envelope, the architect really worked with the community board a lot and really did a lot of solar carving into their building to make sure, and a lot of solar analysis to make sure that none of the shadows would at least be directly, did their best to do that, especially during the environmental review process.
This goes back to Mr. Puka's question at the beginning, right? The lot can be easily sold, and then the next architect cannot be held to any of these negotiations.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that is correct, Kaya. I just want to point out that yes, the zoning does have requirements, limitations on what can and what cannot be built. That the backyards have to be a certain size, and that there are setback requirements. So yes, hopefully the applicant for the rezoning is the one who will develop as they presented it in public. But the zoning does allow for an envelope within which a building can be built.
And can you send us something in the chat about this transition rule? Is this neighboring? I still don't understand it.
Yes, definitely, Kaya. I can link you to that transition rule. Give me a minute though.
Okay, no problem.
And I just want to add, in Gowanus, we updated the zoning along pretty much the entire 4th Avenue corridor from 15th Street to Atlantic, to an R9A level density. So similar to the density proposed by the Atlantic Avenue applications. And that was really intended to, because we found that was an appropriate height and density along the corridor, but also in order to map MIH as well.
Thank you, Jonah. I see, Kathy, are you waving your hand? Is this a new query? Okay. And I just wanted to check, Mr. Puka, also, you don't have a new question?
I have a new question.
Okay, let's go. And last question.
Okay, last question. So my question, I guess, urban design, I think Jonah, you just mentioned 4th Avenue was rezoned recently as part of the Gowanus. I have a process question. 4th Avenue was rezoned before it was just rezoned as part of the Gowanus upzoning. It was upzoned a couple of years back. So it just seems to me like I like to know, like, what's the process? Does, like, in other words, does de Blasio say, like who makes the decision for the borders of a rezoning? And is that like the mayor's call? Is that DCP's call? I'm not sure again, that this question might be a little bit off topic than what we're supposed to be discussing, but I'm just curious about, like, the process of an actual rezoning or not zoning. Does it come from the mayor says, we need more affordable housing, so DCP, please point out areas of our city where an upzoning could take place? Or is it more coming from DCP telling the mayor, saying, hey, here's some opportunities where we could upzone? So I just want to know, I don't want to know more about the process. If it can be discussed tonight, I don't know. Thank you. And I also want to say one thing, no matter how many, we can all disagree on policies and the zonings and where they are and what goes on. But in this age of massive divisive politics, I just want to stress that we all should remember that nothing is personal and everything is just part of business. So I just hope that everyone, not that I think it's not happening tonight, but I'm just saying that I just hope in general that we always maintain that focus, that to keep at least to try and keep New York City politics not as divisive as Washington is. So that's just my comment. Thank you.
Ms. Weatherburn, is it okay if I answer the question?
Yes, Mr. Von Engel, it's okay for you to answer the question.
All right, it's a great question. Look, we at the Department of City Planning, we work for the mayor, right? So if the mayor asks us to do something, we fulfill his mandate. But it also works obviously in the other way around, right? We do make recommendations to the mayor for policy changes or initiatives and things like that. And we often make those recommendations based upon what we hear, the kind of input that we get. And I can tell you that when it comes to the M-Crown planning process, that we are going to recommend that to the next administration as an effort that we think is worth pursuing for the next administration. And we would encourage you to continue to support this effort, to let your new council member know, to let the mayor know that you support this. And then on the technicalities of where the boundaries are, I doubt that a mayor would get so specific as saying, you know, include this block and don't include the other block. But technically, you know, as our boss, he could say that. But more generally, mayors will defer to their agencies, which, you know, what is the best way to fulfill their requests, their policies and directives.
Winston, thank you very much for that answer. But so just if I can ask specifically about the Gowanus rezoning, I mean, it's the largest rezoning so far of the de Blasio administration. And everyone just thinks it just includes Gowanus. Not many people, except people like us who are in the weeds, realize that it goes all the way to Pacific Street and 4th Avenue. So, you know, why? So again, I'm trying not to put you on the spot. Was that DCP's call to rezone 4th Avenue again after it was already rezoned a couple of years back? Or was that the mayor's call? I'm just curious.
So the mayor's directive was to obviously look at Gowanus. He's, as you can imagine, very familiar with the area, and as a former council member, I would say distressed that the rezoning did not include incentives or requirements for affordable housing. So he asked us to look at 4th Avenue. How can we, for the remaining parts of 4th Avenue that have not yet been fully developed, how can we mandate affordable housing be included in new developments? And that is legally only possible with an upzoning. And so we looked at, you know, is it appropriate to rezone 4th Avenue to a higher density? And again, we looked at it from an urban design perspective as well as from an environmental perspective. You know, is the streetscape good? Is it something that works, that doesn't overwhelm 4th Avenue, as well as all the other things, schools and parks and sewers and water and the air. So, you know, based upon that, at some point, the plan was presented to him, and we pointed out that 4th Avenue would be upzoned as a result of that, and he signed off on that.
Thank you so much for the answer. Again, I wish everybody a happy and healthy holidays and New Year. Thank you.
Great question. Thank you.
Ms. Islin, I see you have a comment in the chat. Would you like to address your question to Chair Witherspoon?
Who are you speaking to?
Were you speaking to Elaine or to me, Sharon? Sorry.
Kathy.
Okay. Well, I just, Jonah referred to something happening between Community Board 8. I'm sorry, I don't mean to be inarticulate, but between Community Board 8 recognizing that there needs to be more comprehensive planning. And I'm just interested in that information, and if that's has happened on a committee level or conversations between the chair and DCP, it would be great to know a little bit more about that. So that sounds great. It'd be great to know a little bit more about it. Thank you. Or perhaps I've missed a meeting. I don't know.
Well, we have not had any discussions, me personally, with DCP. These are discussions that have happened in the planning since what, 10 years ago with M. Crown. So this is not a recent conversation. These are things that we have identified long ago that were needed as we move forward to try to accomplish some of those things at least. So that's the extent of the conversation, but we are well aware of a lot of the needs and the concerns brought about by everyone. So this is really not a new thing. So that's my answer.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I think we're all expressing, it seems commonality, that there's a real recognition of population and development happening very quickly on a scale that's really quite remarkable and brings with it lots of challenges and lots of opportunities. And Elaine put a very interesting request in the chat as well, that it would be great to calendar a meeting that furthers these planning conversations. So thank you.
Kathy, as soon as possible, actually, and Winston responded back in the chat. So we appreciate if Jonah and et al. Could put something together as quickly as possible. I think it feels like there's a train on the track and we're running after it. It's already past us. So knowing how the city sometimes moves a little more slowly than we might need as a neighborhood and as a community, it's scary to watch it all happening and know that there's not enough planning in other areas that we need to make this neighborhood and our homes much more livable. So we thank you all for arranging this as soon as possible.
I just want to thank everyone that has attended this meeting. Thank you so much, Mr. Van Engel. Thank you, Mr. Hirakawa, and Mr. Rogoff, as well as your other team members that might be present for this discussion and presentation. We really, really appreciate it. And we look forward to more conversation and action moving forward. So I want to wish everyone a happy holiday, a Merry Christmas, and a fabulous start to the new year. So if there's nothing further, we'll say good evening and see you next year. Thank you so much.
Good evening.
Thank you.